So just like any other build, we take out a permanent marker, mark off all the mold lines, and start removing them with a sanding stick. The mold lines are now removed, so we can move on to just sanding the entire body using a 600 grit sanding sponge from Tamiya, just going over all the nooks and crannies, making sure that everything is nicely scuffed up before we move on to scribing out some of the panel lines, making them a bit deeper and making sure that the paint doesn't fill it up that much. After that, we clean it all up, remove all the dust, and start with primer. So before we apply the first coat of primer, just blow over the entire body again with some air, making sure that it's all nice and clean and that there's no remaining dust on there. Then start applying the primer in those hard to reach, easy to forget spots first, and then move on to the main body for a first light coat. So as always, the first coat is not to be for the full coverage, just apply it lightly and build it up in a couple of various coats until you're satisfied with the coverage and a nice smooth finish. And it's also enough for you to sand it down a bit, smooth it up, and move on to color later on. The first coat is now applied to the body, so we also apply a light coat to all the other parts like the hood, the spoiler, and the mirrors. So the first coat is now applied to all parts and pieces. We let it sit for about 5 minutes to dry off, top off the airbrush, and move on to the second coat. Since we want to build up a bit of thickness in the primer, we let it sit for another 5 minutes, applied a third coat, and then let it sit for about 45 minutes to an hour before we started moving on to sanding it all nice and smooth with some Tamiya sanding sponges, and then cleaning out all the dust with a fine brush and moving on to applying the color coat. So since you guys did not really want to see another dull, dark color, I decided to go with a bright orange. This time I used the Inferno orange color for the Camaro. Just started with blowing over the entire body again, removing all of the loose or remaining dust, and then started on those hard to reach, easy to forget spots and moved on to the first light coat for the rest of the body. The first coat is now applied, and as you can see, it's still not completely covered. You can still clearly see all the primer through it, and that is exactly the point. Just take it slow, don't go too thick, rather add one more coat than one too thick. So after that was applied, I let it sit for about 5 minutes, topped up the airbrush, and moved on to applying the second coat, a bit thicker, gaining a bit more coverage, and moving on to letting it dry again for another 5 minutes and applying the third and final coat in the same manner as I'm applying the second one. So as mentioned, after applying the second coat, I moved on to letting it dry for another 5 minutes, topped up the airbrush again, and applied the third and final coat, just like the same way I did the second coat. And with that, the color is nicely covered all the way. Now you could decide to add another fourth coat, letting it dry for another 5 minutes in between to completely finish it off and be sure that it is fully covered. Now I decided that 3 coats was more than enough. Let it dry for about 2 hours before masking it off for adding the second color next video.